Welcome. Today I figured we are going to talk about cinematic camera setup. I've noticed that a lot of people, are not very clear on how to set up cinematic cameras and cinematic lighting. I will not go into the lighting part today. I'll do this in a separate video, but this is going to be about setting up the camera. Now, I really just built this in the last couple of hours. I took inspiration from a Midjourney image, so I figured I can probably build this in Unreal Engine relatively quickly. So this is it's not quite the same, but um, as I said, this was really just done in a couple of hours, and I think it's a good setup to kind of like demonstrate cinematic camera setups. Now, to to kind of like mention a little bit where I'm coming from. If you go to my other tutorials, you will see that I have Unreal tutorials and I have camera tutorials. And the reason for that is that cameras are kind of like have been my bread and butter for a long time. And for this presentation, I thought it might be fun to just put in, a selection of cameras that I've used over the years. So the oldest cameras that I've ever done anything with, shot anything with, are about 100 years old. So this is a French Sept and a DeVry, from a company in Chicago. Um, Eclair Camflex, which is a French camera. Eclair MPR, this is a 16 millimeter camera. This here, by the way, is the only camera that I'm aware of that can shoot 35 and 16 millimeter film. Um, Shot Super 8 on Beaulieu. This is a French Beaulieu Super 8. This is a French Beaulieu 16 millimeter, very similar to the Bolex, which I don't have in that list. Uh, I shot with Atons, LTRs, XTRs. This is an LTR. This is an A Minima, just great little camera. Um, of course, Ariflex SRs, SR1, SR2, SR3, Ariflex 416. So these are 16 millimeter cameras. Um, Reflex 35 millimeter cameras. This is a 35-3, but all the way to the 2C. This is a BL. There's also several incarnation of those. Moviecam Compact, Austrian camera, which then later on was purchased by Ariflex and turned into the Aricam. Then Panavision, yeah, the G2 Gold 2 is an example here. The Aton 35-3. I used to be a photosonics technician, so I've worked with photosonics cameras. This is a 4ER right here. This is an Action Master. That's a 16 millimeter. That's a 35 millimeter camera. I've shot on the Sony F900, which is the first HD camera. These are the Star Wars prequels 2 and 3 were shot with that. And I used to also be a Phantom technician. So this was, in the HD days when Phantom built an HD camera. Then Red One, Red Epic, Red Gemini, Red Komodo. About to get my hands on a Raptor. And then, of course, Alexa Classic, XST, Alexa Mini. So, so the only reason I'm showing this is because I just wanted to show you guys. I didn't just pick up a DSLR and kind of like came up with some of the stuff. I've really been dealing with high-end cameras all the way from like the Super 8, for example, or even Blackmagic cameras. I'll put those more into the consumer grade area, and all the way to high end, like Panavision and Ariflex and whatnot. So and I've been doing this for about 20 years. So and in since about a couple of years, I'm also working inside Unreal Engine. And I enjoy combining the two very much. But so without further ado, let's get into the camera setup. So to kind of like just give you an idea how this here is done. So this is a very simple setup right here, very simply put together. And one of the first things that's already in here, but I'm going to hide it. Whoops. Maybe not. I'm just going to show you how to set up a post-process volume, because that is an important step. So you're going to need to go into your volumes, and when you go onto here, just type in post, and you can come up with a post-process volume. So this is now a second one right here. And the first thing you want to do with this post-process volume, you want to make it infinite. Otherwise, it's only going to take effect when your camera is physically in it. So you want to type in infinite and check the infinite extent checkbox right here. So, and now in your post-process volume, you want to set a few things that are rather important. Now, a lot of this stuff we can set up in the cameras. It is convenient doing it in the post-process volume because it will affect all the cameras unless you change unless you highlight the setting and change it inside the camera. The camera will essentially take its settings from here. So it makes a lot of sense to do some of the things in here, but I will, so for this to be less confusing, I'll just set up, a couple of things, and then the rest we'll do in the camera. So one of the most important thing that you're gonna need to do is you're gonna need to change the metering mode to, which this is by default the engine is set up to auto exposure, which is a problem. So we're going to change this to manual, and we're gonna set this to 0. And what's most likely going to happen on your end right now, if you set up the lighting, it's probably going to go completely black. And this is then when you have to just go in here and start adjusting. In this case, my lights have been adjusted to match this. So you're going to have to go into your lighting intensity and just up that until it looks the way you want it. But this now is also, so this is measured in candelas right here. This is a much more realistic reading. I think off the truck they come like at 8 candelas or something. So so this is a much more realistic setting right now. And with that now, once you have relit that scene using your post-process volume in this way, you're ready to drop in a camera. And so in this particular case, what I'm gonna do is I have a whole bunch of cameras in here for demo purposes. I'll show you those later, but I'll now create a camera. So you wanna place a Cine Camera Actor. Create camera here, Cine Camera Actor. Not a camera actor. So you just want to go place your Cine Camera Actor. And then in this case, I am going to my placed actor number 14. So this is our Cine Camera Actor. And now let's take a look on how this comes off the truck. So the first thing is it's, you have to figure out what your film gauge is. So when I showed a bunch of different cameras before, some were Super 8, some were digital, some were 35, some were, well, actually, of those, no, but some of them may have a large sensor. So the thing is that you want to match this to a certain look that you're interested in. So if you want to make it look like a certain movie that you have seen that you like, then it makes sense to look up what it was shot on, and to adjust your camera accordingly. One of the things that's important to note is that not all, different manufacturers make sensors slightly different. So for example, if I switch this here to Super 35, right, then I will get, 24.8 by 18.66. Now, I'm sure this is true for for this is probably true for film. But then on the other hand, if I now go and Google, like, let's say a red Komodo, sensor size, then, which is also advertised as Super 35, then you can see right here we are getting a larger sensor. So the red Komodo still qualifies as Super 35, so you can see this right here, but it is actually slightly larger, right? Which actually matters when it comes to lens choices on that camera. But you know, if you really want to match that red Komodo, for example, which, you know, is actually a very good camera to shoot on a in virtual production on a volume because it has a global shutter. So then you would probably want to match this setting right here. So, but I'm gonna leave it here at Super 35. Now, a lot of movies have been shot on Super 35 or on a regular 35. So this would be 35 Academy. 35 millimeter Vista Vision is running the film sideways through, so it's almost twice as big actually as 35 Academy. So that actually compares a lot more to 35 millimeter DSLR. IMAX is the biggest one that's on here, so that's 65 millimeter film for 70 millimeter projection. The smallest film that's on here is Super 8. And then there's also, of course, Super 16, which is kind of like an in-between. Super 8 is pretty much never used for professional motion picture production. There may be some segments or music videos can be shot with this. Super 16, some films have been shot on that. You know, Black Swan is a good example. So it's not very commonly shot, but it has been done. Super 35 and 35 are these are the most common, even though lately large format, so that would be this here or this here or even this here, is essentially becoming the standard, really, nowadays. So more and more movies are shot in large format. But I'm sticking now with Super 35. And one thing that is greatly misunderstood is just because this is the sensor size of a Super 35 millimeter camera, it doesn't mean we're shooting this format. The reality is that the vast majority of movies are cropped in one way or another, and you actually have right here a crop setting right here. It says no crop, and if you look right here, the most common and this is actually you know, the guys from Epic should update this because there is a couple of issues here. The 235 is the standard. I'm sorry, 239 is the standard for widescreen. So this is correct. 177:1 equates to 16:9. And 133 equates to roughly 4:3. Now that is the silent aspect ratio. So if I click on that, nothing is really much going to change. So that was silent. For sounds, the old aspect ratio was actually 137:1, and the most common movie aspect ratio besides 239 is actually 185:1 and not 177. So if you know, in this case, we would want to do this custom, right? But we're gonna stick with 239 widescreen. That's a nice format. It's very cinematic. One of the things that you do want to consider when you make these choices is that, you know, there should be a reason, I believe, why you make some choice. You shouldn't just pick 133 or 137 just because it's vintage. One of the things that you do need to be aware of is that this is associated with television by a lot of people, at least those people who are used to still have had a 4:3 television. And television was before the streaming boom started. Movies that were done for television were associated with being cheaper made. So there certainly is a subconscious relation between this aspect ratio and it not being as valuable or expensively made a movie as this aspect ratio. This is probably going to change now that essentially streaming has started playing around with aspect ratios, and streaming shows are essentially getting more funding than some movies. So there's certainly some changes that will be made, but or a way that this is going to feel different in the future to future generations. But at this point, generations that have grown up with the older style televisions will probably still have subconsciously this association. So it's just, it's your call. I'm just making you aware of it. Okay, so now we have set up the manual exposure on our post-process volume, and the rest I'm gonna do in camera, even though most of this you can also do in the post-process volume. I'm going to delete my second post-process volume now because I've already set this up, and I don't want to conflict this. Okay, so we are going. So we have our Cine Camera Actor here. Which I forgot I already did that. So yeah, so we're already in the camera. So it's Super 35, and we are at a 239 crop. All right. So the first thing we're going to set up here is our focal length. And for a reason that I don't quite know, 11.88 is the go-to choice of Epic Games. And this is really not a focal length that I'm aware of it is existing. Maybe it does. I don't know. But usually, focal lengths are in millimeters, and there are 11 millimeter lenses for sure. So this would be on the wide end, a standard focal length that you would see is a 16 millimeter, for example. Let's actually go to our camera so we can see the changes. There we were on it. Okay, let me just. Okay, yeah. All right, so just to see that. So here is an 11. That would be a fairly standard, already on the wide set of the end of the lens set. A 16 is still a very wide lens. For Super 35, then, you would then probably have in a set a 25. Whoopsie. 25 mil. So that's kind of like this. You would then have a 35, which is kind of like your normal lens in Super 30. Well, Super 35 is a little bigger than normal 35, so that would be probably more like a 45 is your normal lens. So in between 35 and 50 is normal. And when I say normal or standard, we're talking about the way your eyes kind of like see the world. So this would be in between 35 and 50 millimeter. If this is a DSLR, then it would, with a full size sensor, then this would be more of a 50 millimeter. And then we go into the telephoto range. So we would probably in a set maybe have a 75 millimeter and potentially a 90 millimeter and maybe 100 millimeter. Or 125, and so obviously camera position has never changed. You can see as I'm upping this focal length, you can you can essentially you can see how the higher number brings us closer, or at least in makes it look like it's closer. One thing that is important to notice is that the longer lens, so a 100 millimeter would be called a long lens, is, the longer the lens is, the more it compresses space. So look at the elevator door behind our character on a 100 millimeter lens, and look how close it looks she actually is to that door. If I go now to, let's say, a 25 millimeter, it will look like she is farther away. Or even, going to back to an 11. Whoopsie. 11. Yeah. So it looks like there is more space between her and that door, the wider focal length I'm going to, right? So let me do another extreme here, 200. So you see, it looks like she's standing right in front of it now, or it's right, the door is right behind. So this is really the way that the lens crops out the image, So we're technically zooming in and out. So on a movie set, you would not, you would, well, some cinematographers do use zooms, but most of the time, primes are being used. Now, if you want to match an exact set, then all you got to do is just find your set online and then find out what the focal lengths are. So I just Googled right here, Cook S4s. So, so this right here shows you, S4 is an 18, a 21, a 25, 32, 40, 50, 65, 75, 100, and 135. The T2.8 is the aperture, so this is how much light they can let through. This is admittedly not a very fast lens, especially nowadays. They're pretty much on the slow end. Very good lenses, but a little slowish. So, all right. And this is right here is this aperture. So you see the aperture is the, should have left that window open. I'm going to demonstrate this to you. So the aperture is this right here. So, your lens is wide open. The higher that this number goes, the more this lens closes, and the more the darker your image gets. The lens before you saw was advertised as a 2.8. So this means that it can only let this much light through. Okay, so some lenses are faster. Once you go faster than 2, then it's called super speed. And once you get faster than 1 at this point, which there isn't much, lenses are often referred to as knocked, N-O-K-T, I believe, lenses. And so because they're extremely light sensitive. So I personally use these apertures. These are the full stops right here. I use these apertures. I use these numbers also in the engine. And the reason why I like using them is because I also know that with each stop, if I close it down with each stop, you are cutting the light in half. So you're cutting your exposure in half. So 2 is cutting it in half of 1.4. 2.8 is cutting the brightness in half of 2, and so forth. And this is good to know, because this also then later on relates really well to the ISO of our camera, so we can really kind of like work with this. Okay, so you can see that we're at a 2.8 now. If I now go and close this lens by, let's say, 2 stops, then the image is going to get darker. Whoops, didn't mean to type in. So the image has gotten darker. What's a little bit difficult to see now, because because it got darker, is that also now our door should be a little bit more in focus. And this is an important thing to realize when, okay, I'm trying to find my camera. There we go. So here's our camera ISO. And I'm gonna play with the shutter in a second. I'll show you that. But the ISO is set to 100, which is, the ISO is the sensor's light sensitivity. And if you want to, again, adjust this to real world settings, then you will find that if the fastest motion picture film stock made by Kodak would be 500 ISO nowadays, and the average camera, the average Cine camera nowadays is around 800 ISO. These numbers have been creeping up, but that's your average. So in this case scenario, I was lit for a 2.8, and I closed down by 2 stops. So you can, let me just bring this back here so you can see this, right? So I was at a 2.8 and I closed down by 2 stops. Now the way I can compensate for this right here is by increasing the number and by doubling it every time. So from 2.8 to 4, that would be 1 stop. That is, in terms of ISO, from 100 to 200. So if I double the ISO, I am increasing the light sensitivity. I'm doubling the light sensitivity. If I then double it from 200 to 400, I'm again doubling the light sensitivity. So I have, with my lens, I have cut it down. These are called stops. I've cut it down by 1 stop, and then I've cut it down by 2nd stop. And if I want to compensate this now to look exactly the way it looked before, then I gotta go 100 to 200 is the 1 stop, and then 200 to 400 is the 2nd stop. So in this case, 400 is gonna give us the same lighting, the same brightness than we had before. Now, if I now up this again by, let's say, 2 stops, so it would be 1600, right? 800, and then 800 times 2 is 16. So 1600. So now, let's even go 3200. So now up this by 3 stops. And in order to compensate for it, I gotta go F8, 16, 11, 16. And then, by the way, if you the way it works is that every second number doubles. So the next one would be a 22. Okay. So, and then 32 and so forth. So we're gonna go now to a 16. And that's gonna give us the same image. But now you should be able to clearly see what has happened. As I'm closing the aperture down, my door has come more and more into focus. And that's because we are increasing the depth of field. Now, plain and simply, if you want to shoot more cinematic in the engine, you want to have a shallower depth of field most of the time. So in other words, it makes a lot more sense to leave your aperture at something like, a super speed 1.2 or 1.4, and then adjust your ISO, or ideally actually your lighting, in accordance to that. Okay. So in this case, we probably need to go down to something like a 50, or yeah, this was not even that. Okay, there we go. So now the other thing is that your shutter speed, a camera shutter, is the speed is kind of like double your frame rate. So what this means is, this comes from movie cameras. And by the way, you see now how I opened up the lens, and you see, look at the doors, right, as opposed to before. So if you want to have shallow depth of field, open up your lens. Just leave it open. Now in the real world, what I just did, compensating with my ISO like that, this is not a good idea, because you're actually affecting the camera's dynamic range negatively. And if you're going into the wrong direction, you can also introduce a significant amount of noise. So this is not something you want to do. But in the engine, this doesn't happen, so it doesn't matter. Okay, so now the way a shutter works, let me see if I can find something online for you guys. So the way a movie camera shutter works is it rotates in front of the gate, and the thing is that the film stops when it's being exposed, so when this is open, and then this shutter rotates in front, and that's when the film is being transported. Otherwise, this whole thing would be a blur. So as this rotates in front, the film is being transported, and because it is a semicircular shutter, it means that half the time the film is being exposed and half the time the film is being transported. And that at 180-degree shutter, which is standard in the US at least, at 180-degree shutter, you therefore get at 24 frames per second an exposure time of 1/48th per second. So the standard motion picture speed is 24 frames in the theater, and so the shutter speed for that would be 1/48th, and that's where this setting right here should be. If you're doing 30 frames, which is television, or technically 2997 US television, but if you're doing that, then you want to set this back to 60. But we're talking here about cinematic, and we're now setting this to 1/48th. Okay, so another thing that is going to affect your depth of field and how cinematic this whole thing looks is actually your film back. So and this I have set up with other cameras, so I'm just gonna show this to you. So because if when a sensor, let's see, sensor size differences. So there are tons of different sensor size differences. In the professional world, these are kind of like consumer grade stuff, but in the professional world, they tend to relate to motion picture film gauges. and you can see that the obviously, if this was a picture now, if we're using the same lens, the sensor size will crop out the image, right? So here is a, you know, a comparison between a full frame sensor, and then that would be probably your kind of like Cine 35, Super 35, and then Micro Four Thirds. So you can see that it doesn't matter if the lens projects it there, if there's no sensor, it doesn't matter. It's, you know, it's gonna crop the image. So what that means is, in order to get the same field of view, you need to adjust your focal length, right? So that means that on cameras with a larger sensor, your normal slash standard lenses will be longer. So while on a full frame, a standard sensor would be, a standard lens would be around 50. On a Super 35 or 35 millimeter, it would be 35 millimeter motion picture, that is, sorry. It would be more in the 35 millimeter region in order to get the same field of view. So if you now go up to like IMAX, you're more in a realm of like 75, 95 for a normal lens. And this matters because the focal length also is going to affect our depth of field. So, and the way this rule goes is that the longer your focal length is, the shallower your depth of field gets, and the wider your focal length is, the shorter your focal length is, the greater depth of field you have. So if I now, so I'm gonna demo this now with my other cameras right here that I've set up, and I'm gonna start out with a non-cinematic film format. It is a film format, but it's not very cinematic. It's not really used for motion picture, as I said before, other than you know, things like music videos. But it's a good example because it's kind of like an extreme. So a Super 8 camera has a very, very tiny target size sensor, if you will. It's not a sensor, but so you can see that because it's cropping out very much, my Super 8 right here is really cropping out, you know, my wide shot, and it's very you know, zoomed in, if you will. And if I now go in my Super 8 to a 35 millimeter, yeah, so 35 is my next one, then you can see, so now we're going even farther in. So this is only a 35 millimeter lens. And we're already into a medium close-up right here, or a medium shot, I'm sorry. And you can see that, you know, we are wide open on this lens, I believe. So let's take a look. We are, this is this one. So we're wide open, and that counteracts, yes, 1.2. So that kind of like helps with the shallow depth of field, because, you know, if I up this just to a 2, it's going to get darker for a minute. But you can see immediately this drops into focus. So go back to 1.2. And but you know, so you see we're very far in already. And then I'm going to go to from a 35 to a 75, and now we're in a close-up, and then I have prepped for you guys right here a 125, which is kind of like a choker. So this is a close-up that's kind of like almost uncomfortable, and you can see that, you know, that we're very far in. So in the case of a Super 35 millimeter camera, which, until fairly recently was the standard in motion picture. An 11 millimeter will give you this, as opposed to Super 8 sensor, this. All right, I think now it becomes very obvious. Okay, so 11 millimeter will give you this, and then you're going to a 35 millimeter, and we're going to a 75 millimeter, and we're going to a 125 millimeter. So note the shallow depth of field, right? We're again on a 1.2, but now the background's gotten very, very blurry. And in the next one, it's going to get even blurrier because we are stepping this up to a DSLR sensor, which is very similar to the VistaVision one. Probably should have used VistaVision just to not confuse people, but this is kind of like what's called full frame. Now, important, movie cameras until very recently were not full frame. They were smaller, more like this. Okay, so again, we are now going on a 11 millimeter. And maybe I can click on here to compare this. So this is now the full frame 11. This is the Super 35 11. You can see the difference right there. And now I am going on the 35 millimeter, which is, where are you? Okay, did I label it wrong? I think I labeled it wrong. It's gotta be, I didn't label it. So I'm gonna assume this is it. I can tell you in a second. So yeah, so this is supposed to be the 35, and let me just fix this here. And then I'm gonna go to the 75, and I'm gonna give you the 75 in comparison of the Super 35 sensor, right? And you can see right here how, because we are longer, we're farther away still, so the field of view is still wider out, but we are already more out of focus because we got a shallower depth of field in the background than we are here. And then we're gonna go all the way up to the 125 and compare that here also to the 125. Okay, so a little farther away, but shallower depth of field. And this is really one of the most important things when it comes to cinematic setups. Now, there's one more thing that I'm gonna go into, and that is your, let me go to something, maybe this here. Okay, this I do want to address the lens bloom. The thing is that off the truck, there is a vignette on it, which is fine. It has a cinematic feel to it. So let me show this to you. Should be under image effects right here. So there is a 0.4 vignette on it, and if I up this, so it's kind of like some people also, but it's extreme, it's called portholing. But you can see that it's kind of like it's darkening the edges like, the lens barrel is having an effect on the image brightness. And you can adjust this here. So by default that is on. If you want to composite with these, you may want to turn this off altogether. But by default it's at 0.4, I believe. So lens flare is also, there's also the intensity is on by default. Now that can be an issue. You might not want that, or you want it stronger. So that's totally up to you. Just be aware that by default this is on. What is interestingly enough not on is the bloom. So if I turn this off, then you can see, the image has a very sharp feel, an overly sharp feel, in my opinion. It looks very digital. And if you start to, add a lens bloom, right? You can see now this light has much more of a bloom to it. At least to my taste, this starts to look better. This starts to look more realistic. Because lenses do bloom, especially if you point them at a light, there is gonna be a certain level of bloom. The other thing is that vintage lenses are extremely popular in quite some time now, because as the film industry transitioned from shooting on film to shooting on digital, there is it just, again, it looked too sharp. It kind of like had this look right here, and by using older lenses that may not, that are not computer designed and are less perfect, they have more bloom to them, and that actually softens the image and gives it a bit more character. So this is something that you might actually like. So play around with this. Initially, when you're switching this on, it feels like, whoa, this may be much, but it may. I think this could probably even go farther, right? We could probably even go to 25. Yeah, I'm perfectly fine with that. So I think that this is actually an improvement over this. All right, and so I don't want to overload you guys with information on this. I could go a lot deeper into this, but this is kind of like your very basic setup on how to get a more cinematic look in your camera setup. And so I hope that this was some help. And with that, I wish you a nice day.